Hi, boys and girls. My name is Suzanne Waters, and I'm going to read you one of my favorite books of all time. It's called Thank You, Mr. Falker by Patricia Falker. When I finish reading it, you'll understand why. The grandpa held the jar of honey so that all the family could see, then dipped a ladle into it and drizzled honey all over the cover of a small book. The little girl just turned 5. "Stand up, little one," he cooed. "I did this for your mother, your uncles, your brother, and now you." Then he handed the book to her. "Taste." Taste. She dipped her finger into the honey and put it into her mouth. "What does that taste?" the grandma asked. The girl answered, "Sweet." Then all the family said in a single voice, "Yes, and so is knowledge, but knowledge is like the bee that made that sweet honey. You have to chase it through the pages of a book." The little girl knew that the promises to read was hers at last, and soon she was going to learn to read. Tricia, the littlest girl in the family, grew up loving books. Her school teacher mother read to her every night. Her redhead brother brought his books home from school and shared them. And whenever she visited the family farm, her grandfather or grandmother read to her by the stone fireplace. When she turned 5, she went to kindergarten and most of all hoped to read. Each day she saw the kids in the first grade across the hall reading. And before the year was over, some of the kids in her own class began to read. Not Tricia. Still, she loved being at school because she could draw. The other kids would crowd around her and watch her do her magic with the crayons. "In first grade, you'll learn to read," her brother said. In first grade, Tricia sat in a circle with the other kids. They were all held in our neighborhood. Their first reader, sounding out letters and words. They said, "Boy, look." The teacher smiled at them, and when they put all the sounds together and got a word right. But when Tricia looked at a page, all she saw were wiggling shapes, and when she tried to sound out words, the other kids just laughed at her. "Tricia, what are you looking at in that book?" they'd say. "I'm reading," she'd say back to them, but her teacher would move on to the next person. Always when it was her turn to read, the teacher had to help her with every single word. And while the other kids moved up to the second reader and the third reader, she stayed in our neighborhood. Tricia began to feel different. She began to feel dumb. So sad, isn't it? The harder words got the little girl, the more and more time she spent drawing. How she loved to draw. Who out there loves to draw? Do y'all like to draw? Or do you like to read? Or just sitting and dreaming? Or when could she? Going for walks with her grandmother. One summer day, she and her grandmother were walking together in the small woods behind their farm. It was twilight. Do you know what twilight means? It's right when the sun's coming down. The air was sweet and warm. Fireflies were just coming up from the grasses. As they walked, Tricia said, "Grandma, do you think I'm different?" "Of course," her grandmother answered. "To be different is the miracle of life. You see all those little fireflies? Everyone is different. Do you think I'm smart?" Tricia didn't feel smart. Her grandmother hugged her. "You're the smartest, quickest, dearest little thing ever." Right then, the little girl felt safe in her grandma's arms. Reading didn't matter so much. Tricia's grandmother used to say that the stars were holes in the sky. They were the light of heaven coming from the other side. And she used to say that someday she would be on the other side where the lights come from. One evening, they lay on the grass together and counted the lights from heaven. "You know," her grandmother said, "all of us will go there someday. Hang on to the grass or you'll lift right off the ground and you'll be there." They laughed and both hung on to the grass. It was not long after that night that her grandmother must have let go of the grass because she went to where the lights were on the other side. And not long after that, Tricia's grandpa let go of the grass too. School seemed harder and harder now. Reading was just plain torture. Even Sue Ellen read her page, or Tommy Bob read his page. They read so easily that Tricia would watch the top of their heads to see if something was happening to their head that wasn't happening to hers. And numbers were the hardest. They were hard. She never added anything right. "Line the numbers up before you add them," the teacher would say. But then Tricia tried. The numbers looked like a stack of blocks, wobbly and to fall over. She just knew she was done. Then one day her mother announced she had gotten a teaching job in California, a long way from the family farm in Michigan. Looks like they're moving. Do you think this is going to be a good move for her? We'll see. Even though her grandma and grandpa were gone, the little girl didn't want to move. Maybe, though, the teachers and kids in her new school wouldn't know how dumb she was. She and her mother and brother moved across the country in a two-tone 1949 Plymouth. It took 5 days. Look at her brother with his crazy red hair. But at the new school, it was the same. When she tried to read, she stumbled over words. The cat ran. She was reading like a baby in 3rd grade. And when her teacher read along with them and called on Tricia for an answer, she gave the wrong answer every time. "Hey, dummy," a boy called out to her on the playground. "How come you so dumb?" Others stood near him and they laughed. Tricia could feel the tears burning in her eyes. How she longed to go back to her grandparents' farm in Michigan. Isn't that sad, guys? Now, Tricia wanted to go to school less and less. "I have a sore throat," she'd say, or "I have a stomach ache." She dreamed more and more and drew more and more, and she hated school more. Then when Tricia started 5th grade, the school was all abuzz. There was a new teacher. He was tall and elegant. Do you know what elegant means? It means very, very nice. And he was elegant. Everybody loved his striped coat and slick gray pants. He wore the neatest clothes. All the usual teacher pets gathered around him. Stevie Joe, Alice Marie, Davy, Michael Lee. But right from the start, it didn't seem to matter to Mr. Falker which kids were the cutest or the smartest or the best at anything. Mr. Falker would stand behind Tricia whenever she was drawing and whispering, "This is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Do you know how talented you are?" Do you think he's making her feel good? Yeah, I think he is. When he said this, even the kids who teased her would turn around in their seats and look at her drawings, but they still laughed whenever she gave a wrong answer. Then one day, she had to stand up and read, which she hated. Can you imagine standing up and reading and you just couldn't read? That'd be horrible. She was stumbling through a page in Charlotte's Web, and the page was going all fuzzy when the kids began to laugh out loud. Mr. Falker, in his plaid jacket and his butterfly tie, said, "Stop. Are all of you so perfect that you can look at another person and find fault with her?" Do you think he stopped all the madness now? I think he did. That was the last day anyone laughed out loud or made fun of her, all except Eric. He sat behind Tricia for 2 whole years, but he seemed almost to hate her. Tricia didn't know why. He waited by the door of the classroom for her, pulled her hair. He waited for her on the playground, leaned in her face, and called her Toad. Tricia was afraid to run, afraid to turn any corner, for Eric would be there. She was completely alone. The only time she was really happy was when she was around Mr. Falker. He let her erase the blackboards. Only the best students got to do that. He patted her on the back, and whenever she got something right, he looked hard and mean at any other kid who teased her. But the nicer Mr. Falker was to Tricia, the worse Eric treated her. He got all the other kids to wait for her on the playground or in the cafeteria or even in the bathroom and to jump out and call her stupid or ugly. Isn't that mean? I know you guys out there are not that mean. I can tell y'all are sweet little boys and girls. And Tricia began to believe them. She discovered that if she asked to go to the bathroom just before recess, she could hide under the inside stairwell during her free time and not have to go outside at all. In that dark place, she felt completely safe. But one day at recess, Eric followed her to her secret hiding place. "Have you become a mole?" he laughed. And he pulled her out into the hallway and danced around her. "Dumbbell, dumbbell, Magdy, oh, dumbbell." Tricia buried her head in her arms and curled up in a ball. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. Who do you think it was? You're right, it was Mr. Falker. He marched Eric down to the office. When he came back, he found Tricia. "I don't think you'll have to worry about that boy again," he said softly. "What was he teasing you about, little one?" "I don't know," Tricia shrugged. But she did know, didn't she, y'all? Tricia was sure Mr. Falker believed she could read. She had learned to memorize what the kid next to her was reading, or she would wait for Mr. Falker to help her with a sentence. Then she'd say the same thing that he did. Good, he would say. Then one day, Mr. Falker asked her to stay after school and help her wash the blackboards. He put on music and brought out little sandwiches as they worked and talked. All at once he said, "Let's play a game. I'll shout out letters and write them on the board with the wet sponge as quickly as you can." He wanted her to do that. "A," he shouted. She wrote a watery A. Big A. 8, he shouted, and she made a watery 8. 14, 3, D, M, Q. He shouted all these letters. Then he walked up behind her, and together they looked on the board. It was a watery mess. Tricia knew that none of the letters or numbers looked like they should. She threw the sponge down and tried to run. I think Mr. Falker's figured it out, guys. But Mr. Falker caught her arm and sank to his knees in front of her. "You poor baby. You think you're dumb, don't you? How awful for you to be so lonely and afraid," she sobbed. "The little one, don't you understand? You don't see letters or numbers the way other people do, and you've gotten through school all this time and full of many, many good teachers." He smiled at her. "That took cunning and smartness and such bravery. Don't you think she was brave?" "I think she was really brave." Then he stood up and finished washing the board. "We're going to change all that, girl. You're going to read. I promise you that." Do you think she learned how to read? Now, almost every day after school, she met with Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy, a reading teacher. And they did a lot of things she didn't even understand. She didn't know. At first, she made circles in sand and then big sponges in the chalkboard and going left to right, right to left. Another day, they flicked letters on a screen and Tricia shouted them out. Still other days, she worked with wooden blocks. But though she read words, she hadn't read a whole sentence. Can you believe she hadn't read a whole sentence yet? And deep down, she still felt dumb. And then one spring day, had it been 3 months or 4 months since they had started? She didn't know. Mr. Falker put a book in front of her. She'd never seen it before. He picked a paragraph in the middle of the page and pointed to it, almost as if it were magic or if light had poured in to her brain. The words and sentences started to take shape on the page as they never had before. She marched them off and off and off. Slowly she read a sentence, then another and another and another. And finally she read a paragraph and she understood the whole thing. She didn't notice that Mr. Falker and Miss Plessy had tears in their eyes. Y'all, she's reading. Isn't that great? That night, Tricia ran home without stopping to catch her breath. She bounded up the front steps, threw open the front door, ran through the dining room to the kitchen. She climbed up on the cupboard and grabbed a jar of, you guessed it, honey. Then she went into the living room, found the book on a shelf, the very book that Grandpa, I'm going to cry, guys, had shown her so many years ago. She spooned honey on the cover and tasted the sweetness. Oh, the honey is sweet, and so is knowledge. But knowledge is like a bee who made the honey, has to be chased through the pages of a book. Then she held the book and honey all and close to her chest. She could feel tears running down her cheek, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were happy, happy tears. The rest of the year became an odyssey of discovery and adventure for the little girl. She learned to love school. I know because that little girl was me, Patricia Plocko. Oh, I'm crying. I saw Mr. Falker again some 30 years later at a wedding. I walked up to him and introduced myself. At first, he had difficulty placing me, and then he remembered me. And I told him how he changed my life. He hugged me and asked what I did for a living. "Why, Mr. Falker?" I answered, "I make books for children." "Thank you, Mr. Falker, thank you." And Patricia Plocko wrote this book. And guys, this was a true story. And so if you're ever out there struggling and you can't read, just remember she overcame too. So here's the assignment for you to do on this book. I want you, if there's somebody who's made you feel really good, whether it's your teacher, your pastor, your brothers, your sisters, your mother, I want you to sit down and write them a letter. And if you don't know how to write, I want you to draw them a picture. And then in the comment section, I want your parents or a guardian to post a picture of it. And I cannot wait to see who you think. Because Patricia Plocko, she thanked Mr. Falker.